There's a verse that people quote at me, and I think it's maybe one of the most misunderstood Bible verses around. And the Bible verse is, say with me if you know it, all scripture, I don't know in King James, all scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction of righteousness, so that instruction in righteousness, so that the man, those the man of God, may be perfect, thoroughly furnished to all good works. First memorized that when I was a kid. I get a lot of people throw that at me, and I think it's probably one of the most misunderstood Bible verses, because when people use it, generally what they're trying to say is the Protestant Bible that I hold in my hand is a magic book from God. There's things I don't like, I can say that's not biblical. When there's things I do like, I can say that is biblical. That basically I can use this book to manipulate my will upon the world and present the version of Christianity that I believe through my interpretations of this book. Let's talk about a couple of the problems with the idea that all scripture is God-breathed. Couple things. First of all, the writer of that letter, 2 Timothy, is famously not Paul. Very few scholars will defend that 2 Timothy was actually written by Paul. It's written at a later time. There are different concerns, church leadership, different things that Paul doesn't seem to be that worried about. It comes along later. Different word uses that Paul doesn't seem to use. Anyway, there's a few different arguments, but in general, scholars agree that 2 Timothy was not written by Paul. So what do you get when you have a book that people use to defend the veracity of Scripture that's not even written by the person who claims to have written it? So it literally starts by saying Paul to Timothy. So like it claims to be written by Paul. It's not written by Paul. It's from an ancient writing practice called pseudepigrapha. Some people call this forgery. Some people say this was just almost like an honorable way to keep somebody's memory going, to write in their name that it was, this happened a lot, and it certainly did happen a lot. So what does it mean already that the book that says all scripture is written by inspiration of God was a lie? That book was already written in somebody's name. Then we could pull this apart a little bit more. All scripture in the Greek, it's passegraphe. Yeah, passegraphe. So like every writing, but graphe is often the way that people would refer to a scripture written by inspiration of God. Is this writer talking about their own writing? I would argue probably not. Actually, I would argue definitely not. The person's not sitting there writing. Imagine you writing a letter and saying in your letter, all scripture is valuable, and like who's sitting to write that letter would be, and that includes this letter, which nobody considers to be scripture because I'm writing it today. So the idea that this particular letter itself was scripture sort of takes like a certain, you have to believe in something miraculous, that basically the writer didn't know that they were writing scripture, and that eventually, hundreds of years later, it would be considered scripture. And that in itself is a nice miracle if you want to believe it, but I don't really see that is a logical way to approach reading this letter. But there's even more, because there's actually even more complications. Because even if this writer is referring to the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians call the Old Testament, there isn't really a fixed Hebrew Bible or Old Testament at this point. There were different books that would be considered scripture. And there's a really wild, obvious clue right in the text itself. Have you ever looked at 2 Timothy 3 verse 8? 2 Timothy 3:8 is talking about how in the last days there will be people who will be boastful and proud and lovers of themselves and lovers of money and all of these terrible things about these people. And it gives you a really nice analogy for the people who will arise in the last days. It says at 2 Timothy 3:8, it says, as Jannes and Jambres, as they opposed Moses, so these people of corrupt mind and counterfeit faith also oppose the truth. Wait, who the heck are Jannes and Jambres? Jannes and Jambres are not names that come from Exodus. So this person, who's not Paul writing 2 Timothy, in the middle of a chapter who talks about the importance of scripture, literally refers to a tradition that comes from a scripture that we don't consider scripture anymore. So this writer, there were different traditions. We don't know exactly where. Origen refers to some kind of book of Jannes and Jambres that was floating around. So there must have been some kind of a scripture that this writer read a scripture that included Jannes and Jambres. We don't even know what that was. But this writer is already quoting something or referring to a scriptural tradition that is literally not in our modern scripture. This writer was reading a different scripture. So to say that all scripture is given by inspiration of God when this writer is actually referring to a writing that we don't even believe is scripture anymore, that seems to create a problem for me. Now, of course, there's going to be an apologist who comes along and says, well, they don't say that Jannes and Jambres is, they don't say that tradition is scriptural. And it's true. If you read 2 Timothy, it doesn't say, as the scripture says, Jannes and Jambres oppose Moses, but it literally just drops very casually into it that clearly the author believes that they are quoting a scriptural tradition, but it comes from some writing that is not considered scripture anymore. And even better, in the Greek, it says passa graphe, which literally means every writing. Because when we hear all scripture, if you hear like a modern translation of this, you think all scripture is like a good way of talking about a book. But if I said to you something along the lines of like every sacred writing or every scriptural writing or something like that, imagine in the context of early Christianity, they're reading all sorts of different things as scripture that we don't read as scripture today. And this writer is saying every writing is given by inspiration of God. Could we assume that this writer might mean books like First Enoch, for example, other traditions we don't know about? It's possible, even though these letters, I think, were written quite late. At the end of the day, this quote that people throw around cannot do the work that people want it to do, because it really just isn't clear that, first of all, it's not written by who it says it's written by. Secondly, it's written at a time when there were all sorts of different things read as scripture. We didn't have a canon, and this writer is clearly reading something else as scripture that includes a tradition of Jannes and Jambres, which Exodus, which is where the story is, Exodus doesn't have this tradition. So this writer is quoting another tradition, probably as scripture. And third, it seems really unlikely to me that this writer, whoever it is, not Paul, was thinking of their own writing as scripture. They're talking about other scriptures. So maybe, just maybe, think twice before you throw this verse at somebody to defend the 66 books that you now read as scripture that literally wouldn't hold together as scripture as a canon for at least a couple hundred years after this verse was written.